this is Ross Coulthard, and you are listening to That UFO Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and this is a special, shorter than normal bonus breakdown. I've grabbed Dan short from packing up his suitcase to head off to a wedding this weekend in sunny Spain, to chat through. We'll get to that in a second. But Dan, welcome.
Hi. Yeah, it's been a busy day packing, but I'm excited for the adventure and to be reunited with my fiance who lives on the other side of the Atlantic. So it's going to be a fun few days.
Who is joining you for said wedding, isn't she?
Yes, she's joining me for the wedding. So we're going to have a whistle-stop tour in Spain and then jump back to Boston, and we'll be in Vermont. So if you're in the area out in Vermont, a number of people have messaged me before about coffees and stuff. I'm going to be back for a couple of months. So just hit me up and it'll be nice to meet you.
Nice. Yeah, definitely hit Dan up. Buy him a coffee. He won't buy you one. He still owes me a bit. No, he will. But listen, yeah, so Dan, I was saying this is a short kind of bonus breakdown, not quite breaking news as such, but the SALT conference last night, it was a 2-day event. Now, the SALT conference is short for the Skybridge Alternatives Conference. This is an event where each year it's aimed at bringing together thought leaders, investors, policymakers, and the like to discuss a wide range of global affairs. It's not a UFO conference. It's not for UFO folks. They are just discussing cutting edge, technology, war situations, and all that kind of stuff. A lot of very rich and influential people, I imagine, nameless, faceless folks are in the audience at these things, listening to what's being said on various stages. Now, last year, Gary Nolan took the stage, and his video from that event last year has over 600,000 views. Comparatively, the second most popular video from that event discussing US and Chinese potential war has 200,000 views. So there's 3 times the interest in Gary Nolan's than there is in the others. Gary Nolan's one, I've got the interview coming out with him, folks, on the paid feeds already. On the free feeds on Friday the 24th, we discussed that and his talk and that event, how important that is. That was last year. Just last night, Dan, Carl, for God's sake, say the name, Dan.
Col.Karl Nell.
Christ. Who calls... Why would you call your son Karl Nell when he's going to clearly grow up to be a colonel? Right. I would say Colonel Karl Nell, okay? That's the end of me trying to pronounce that, folks. He is formerly of the UAP task force. He worked at Lockheed Martin, worked at Northrop Grumman. He worked for a lot of 3-letter agencies. He has a huge and storied CV. He is probably one of the latest names that came out round about the Grush time to talk on the UFO UAP subject. He done a piece that was pretty interesting, slightly mysterious at the Sol Foundation, because he talked about catastrophic disclosure, didn't he? And right. That was something that went kind of viral online at the time. So the beauty is you've got this event. You've got this guy who is starting to become pretty well known in the field of UFOs. Very credible, Dan. I think that's very fair to say, given his background, what he's done. And he seemed to speak incredibly well as well. Similar to Grush, he's not overexposed either, is he?
No, not at all. Carl was, or should I say Colonel Nell, was very calm and collected. He speaks very eloquently on the matter. He came out swinging in this one. And it really shocked me, but I'll just give a little bit of his background. I know he talks about it there and you touched on it, but I really want to drive this home to people, just how qualified this guy is. He basically is a savant, right? He has a master's in electrical engineering, in computer science engineering. The Air Force sent him for that one. Mechanical engineer masters, strategic studies masters. One of the things he was in charge of was modernizing the army. And he basically made an AI kind of system that would take all of the different sensor systems for the US kind of military organizations and put them all together. So if anyone's going to have an overview of the United States airspace and what's in it, it is this guy.
Yeah, I put down that shortened intro for him. One, because I'm extremely tired, as Dan knows. It's been a long week. But it's such a storied CV, isn't it? And that's not even everything, Dan, that you've got down there. This guy he has worked for everyone and anyone.
Lockheed and
That's
Northrop Grumman. I'm just going to throw those names there
yeah.
because people that are familiar with, the UFO subject will know that they're private industry that's been involved purportedly in the cover-up, the UFO cover-up in the past. He worked for both,
Yeah, heavily involved in R&D, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, so you've got a main player here in the world of UFOs in that background, that's starting to come out and talk about the subject on a stage in front of some really serious folks. Who this isn't a UFO crowd; it's not a UFO event. He was a final speaker, and was one that was, quite eagerly awaited. Dan, so we'll fly through some of the questions and what some of the answers were. And I'll be fair, maybe one or two of the non-answers will get.
Yeah,
I've not spoke to you about this yet, and purposely didn't bother texting you last night. I was in bed. I know you were busy on hosting duties with Matt Ford and Lester Nari.
that's right. But I've had a
Lester
little
Tony
more
Love,
time.
I've said his name properly as well. See that? Yeah.
It's been nice to have a little time to digest it, because obviously with these things, you can be blinded by the light sometimes. So I'm looking forward to kind of getting in 24 hours later and seeing what pops out for us.
Do you know what? The host, Alex Klokas, is the same guy who was the host last year for Gary Nolan. I thought he was absolutely excellent, like spot on. He doesn't speak in a derisory way. He doesn't come across like a UFO fanboy. He doesn't come across like he hates the topic or has any, it's just perfect. He does this perfectly. It's a 20-minute interview, folks. The link will be in the description. But it packs a punch. And I said this, Dan, on Twitter, that same with Gary Nolan's from last year. Some folks might be looking, going, well, 20 minutes. Trust me, for that audience, for what he says, 20 minutes is enough. So Alex is wonderful. He goes straight in. First question: does Carl believe a non-human intelligence has visited this planet? Great first question. I mean, it's no
Straight in there,
bullshit.
right?
Yeah, goes in raw, bareback, as some may say. Can I say that one? Yeah, I can. I mean, I decide what to say. I can literally, yeah, I can say anything, but yeah, apologies. So he kind of says, yes, it exists, and its interactions with humanity are ongoing, and the people in the government are aware. And follows up, has zero doubt that this is true. Great question. That's a big statement. That, I'm going to preface and try not to say this too often, might not be a shock to anyone in the UFO community, but bear in mind, frame it that you've got that audience of folks sitting there, millionaires, billionaires, guys in the cutting edge of technology for AI, whatever it may be, different types of silicons, plastics, listening to this. What were your thoughts, Dan, on that?
It was an incredible statement to make, and it's one of those moments where we have to be cognizant of the fact that, like you say, this isn't a UFO crowd. So these big statements are kind of roundups of everything that we've been following over the past 3, 4, 5 years. He's kind of wrapping it up in a ball and just kind of throwing it out as a one-liner. I love that this was followed up on, but I imagine, or I was very surprised at least, that the microphone in the auditorium didn't pick up a bunch of like murmurs and people talking to each other suddenly, when he just unequivocally looked at the audience and said, it exists, it's been interacting with humanity, and I have zero doubt, and that's that. But luckily it was followed up on.
Let me say, I don't doubt that in that moment when he said that, people in that audience will have turned to the people next to them and said, bullshit. Like, oh, this shit again. There will have been an element of that audience, but yeah, I think that speaks to being able to go on that stage and talk about this subject, knowing, look, this isn't what you're here for necessarily, but this can potentially get, and this is something I touch on with Gary Nolan, folks, go and check that one out. This can potentially get a lot of new ears, eyes, fresh blood, fresh investment into the UFO topic that isn't necessarily accessible without doing this kind of stuff.
And you
He's
don't have
asked.
to convince
No,
everyone,
go on.
right? Like,
No.
even if 2% of that audience or 1% of that audience took that to heart and are suddenly curious about it, they're going to be able to have a big impact on the work being done on this subject just because of the resources available to them. I just wanted to note as well, you spoke about the popularity of Col.Karl Nell's talk. I watched live, and I saw the counter go from around 79, 80 people before Col.Karl Nell was on, all the way up to 530 people watching live. Yeah. And then over on the Good Trouble show, our kind of pre and post game analysis, we had over 1,000 people watching. So there's such a big interest in this.
Yeah, 100%. He's asked about what evidence he has seen, and I thought if there's going to be a controversial moment from this for any side of the UFO talk, this might have been it. Because it's a great direct question. So, basically, and I'm paraphrasing, folks, go and watch the talk. What's the evidence you have seen that makes you so certain all of this? Is it fair to say and use the word evades the question? Because his answer is essentially, well, another way to answer that is by asking how can folks in the audience come to an understanding of what this phenomenon is? And I was like, that's not really what he asked you.
No.
And it's
Part
not a
of me,
90-minute conversation you can dip in and out. He asked you a question and he doesn't go back to it. And just let me say the what I've got, Dan, for you to follow in with. He
Sure.
says, he talks about, it being kind of twofold. Talks about folks with access to information at higher levels. Paul Hellyer, the Israeli defense guy, Ishad, the Chris
Hamish, yeah,
Mellon, Dave Grush, Lou Elizondo, basically those folks at higher levels of military who have made statements in the past few years about the UFO topic. Secondly, he mentions members of the Gang of Eight in Congress, Schumer and Marco Rubio, signing the UAP amendment last year. So I get why he's given that as an answer to those folks. At a base level, though, the question of, what evidence have you seen? I don't think that quite answers that. But
yeah.
I'll let you follow in.
Well, I would agree, and I've seen a lot of conversation around this. People kind of saying, okay, well, why is this the answer? And like we've already said, it's 20 minutes, so you got to kind of pack everything in. We can't drill down on quotes of each of these people. But what's curious for me is, Nell here is a replacement for Grush. David Grush was meant to be speaking, and it was kind of swapped out not that long ago. So I wonder what Karl Nell actually had cleared through DOPSA. So many people are wondering, was anything cleared through DOPSA? And was this why he didn't say, I have firsthand seen, XYZ evidence? And actually, the reason he was pointing at these people is because they have gone through DOPSA. So he knows, he was very good at walking that kind of tightrope and line for the whole of this conversation. And I wonder if that's just him hitting a wall, essentially, with his clearances. Mike Colangelo on Twitter posted, X Twitter, posted 4 possibilities that I think are reasonable to consider for this. So one is that he's seen proof but can't or won't talk about it because of lack of clearance, like I said. 2 is that he's doing this for fame or money. 3 is that he's mentally unwell. Didn't seem so, right? He's a fairly put together person, really well spoken. And 4, that he just trusts people within the IC community. So it could be any of those things. But I would say, number 3, I'm going to remove just because, Karl, very well put together person, very accomplished. Doubt he'd have clearances if that was the case. And so he's either doing it for fame or money, which, we know this subject doesn't really pay that well. Stephen Greer even laments it, that his projects don't get enough funding from the crowdfunding kind of.
I'll just say, I'd never agree with that. There isn't money, and there's money in every subject. If people do it right. Yeah. So for me, what he would be getting in the roles he was working in, I doubt he's come into the UFO topic for. Even if he can make $100,000 over a year or two doing, I mean, that's not going to pay that kind of money. This guy was getting high 6 figures, surely, working for all, and that's what doesn't make sense to me. They leave these high flying roles to jump on into a podcast that gets 10,000 downloads for free.
Yeah.
Why? For me, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm with you. So there you go. There's 1, that's 3 and 2 gone. So it's either that he just trusts people's words in the IC community, even though he's more qualified and had more access than all of the people that he kind of nodded to, or that he's seen proof but can't and won't talk about it because of clearance. I'm leaning towards the clearance thing. But for me, it could be both. But we'll see in the future, if Karl does another talk and he's a little bit more open about this question, then it stands to reason that he's had some things cleared through DOPSA that he can talk about, and he knows he won't be thrown behind bars for saying.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. And I think there is an element of, like you say, he's treading carefully. He can't just come out and say, well, there was this video I saw. Well, then could he, talking around it? But again, would that be the right for us? Great answer. He's not on this podcast. He's not on Good Trouble. He's not on Joe Rogan. He's in a pretty serious business-like atmosphere. No doubt with a lot of detractors in front of him, that's not maybe the time to be talking about the time he saw the extra gimbal footage, for example.
Sure.
Maybe not the crowd. So yeah, I can see it on that, but he does evade the question.
He's kind of seeding curiosity here, isn't he? That's
Yeah.
his job, to kind of to hook people. And yeah, I think he did a good job. But let's go to our next bit.
Yeah. He says the government haven't disclosed for essentially 6 reasons, which are national security, lack of a plan, societal disruption, a non-public agreement, potential for misdeeds or the desire to cover up the subject, or organizational lack of priority. Says it's safe to presume national security issue is the top reason, up there with the atom bomb, nuclear weapons, that kind of stuff. Looking at those 6 reasons, I don't see why it's not a case of all of them, to be honest. National security, I get that argument. Lack of a plan seems so. Is it easy to plan for something that they might not know a whole lot about or as much as we think? Potential societal disruption, you can't rule it out. I don't think it's as easy to say that, oh yeah, if they announced it tomorrow, everyone would be fine. We don't know that. And there would surely be elements that would take advantage. Non-public agreement, I'm guessing from that he means that either between nations or various governments or factions within, or even does he mean between us and this other entity? I don't know. Did you think that?
Yeah, absolutely. It seems to allude to the agreements with the non-human intelligence that have been involved in the lore of this subject. Things agreed to right patism between different presidents and things like that. And that's an interesting one as well, if it's going down that path, because the motivation of the others, why they would be here, what they wanted, any agreement is going to shine light on that. So if that's happened and there's paperwork somewhere, or even something that someone can tell the government, hey, we agreed to XYZ, they can have 5 people out of this estate this time of year or something, and they can take a bunch of cows. It'll be good to know, because then we kind of get to know the game and the playing field, and a bit like, just more information as opposed to just being completely in the dark.
Yeah. Again, though, it could be that US, Russia, China at high levels have a look. We all know this is a thing. Let's just, if we can disagree on one thing here, we all know it's in our best interest to keep this quiet, and maybe that's what he meant. But yeah, that was the first thing that came to my mind as well. And I would say at this point, Dan, so far, what's been discussed, and I think probably for most of the conversation, isn't much folks with a deep knowledge of the UFO, subject, or if you're active on social media, would say was new. But again, he's speaking to an audience that much of this will be new to, or they're hearing this from a guy that they're all sitting going, well, we've just heard your background, hearing the backgrounds of other folks who have spoken on that stage over the last 2 days. You're as credible as any in terms of what you've done. These people understand the weight of what he's done and the achievement, and you're sitting saying the most incredible stuff. So yeah, I get it. And we'll get to some of the Twitter comments, but I don't think you can go with nothing burger on this one,
No,
folks. If that's what you were saying, more power to you. But you have to consider everything in one here.
Yeah. You have to be aware of the context, the audience, the reason for this. You know what could potentially come from it. Nell is essentially showing people the opportunity that lays in front of us as a species, and for them as private investors as well.
Yeah.
And so yeah, like I said, this is creating hooks, creating curiosity, and things like this. Just painting a picture professionally and seriously that this is real, and this is something that we need to get on with ASAP.
Yeah, definitely. Flying through, he talks about again the cover up itself leading to catastrophic disclosure. Just by trying to keep this a secret, we get that catastrophic disclosure where all those secrets come out and it's impossible to control. So is it the most sensible thing to do to go for a controlled disclosure, a kind of middle ground? And that's what he thinks may be the case. We're very quickly, Dan, there's a big question, but try and be succinct. Where we stand with the UFO conversation right now, do you see that middle ground still being an option?
Yes. And I say that reluctantly. Carl spoke at this event about how he mentioned mutually assured destruction and nuclear technologies,
Mm.
and how we went from a very unstable world where a number of countries had nuclear technologies and there was conflict brewing, to a place where we all calm down a bit and it's a stable equilibrium of potentially catastrophic proportions. We're kind of between those two places now, where it's a little unstable. It's kind of moving towards a better place. And I think bringing up that kind of nuclear model really illustrated the point real well. We can move on to better things. Countries can say, okay, we're just going to put down the gun here and take this seriously and work together.
He mentions our society maybe at a stage similar to the Bronze Age. I know this is probably your kind of bag with this kind of stuff, where that golden civilization ended. Can you call the Bronze Age a golden civilization? Is that,
I mean, in a certain light, it looks goldy.
contradiction in terms, yeah. But that was an age. It was an end of an era, and in the same sense, given where we are as a society, are we ready? Are we in the place we need to be? Should we have disclosure upon us? And as it stands, I think Alex, in summarising some of what's been said, he does a really good job. We maybe can't know the true intentions of a higher intelligence, even if it literally landed down. How could we as humans go, well, this is why they're here? And that is something you probably see quite readily. Even people I speak to, Dan, people you speak to, will be quite convinced they know why. But if something is that much more intelligent, can you really understand or be confident?
That's exactly the thing that people need to keep in their heads here. Any extraterrestrial intelligence or any other form of intelligence is going to be so weird and outlandish to us that we might not even recognize that it is intelligence at all. And people always say, well, if they're here, why don't they land on the White House lawn? Quite possible they don't understand what the White House lawn is, that they don't recognize our borders and our political system. So why would they land on, the White House lawn? Maybe they'd be more interested in impressionable young minds and doing school landings. We definitely touched on that before about how that influences kind of a conversation in the future. And this part of the conversation was interesting. The book cited the Eric Klein one, I think it was 1777 BC. It's about the year civilization failed in a single lifetime. And it focuses on a few different civilizations. And it talks about, essentially, it mentions a group called the Sea Peoples, who kind of come from over the horizon and kind of surprise and catch off guard. So there's a lot of kind of economic strife, plus that kind of pops the bubble of civilization in those times.
Atlantis?
Say again?
Atlantis type talk?
Kind of, yeah. And I mean, it plays into it for sure.
I'll go with Atlantis.
We always talk about, the Spanish reaching South America, as well as, the British and what happened there. And this plays into what Karl Nell was saying about proactive versus reactive approaches.
Yeah.
Are we going to wait for the ships to come onto the horizon and then react and hope that we do well? Or are we going to go over the horizon and have a look, see what's there and prepare better so that we can really make the most of this opportunity? I've mentioned it before, but travel in Mexico, you can really see how the culture wasn't stamped out. The ancestors are there. The people that live there are the ancestors of the families that were supposedly wiped out. But they were transformed, and so were the invaders, and transformed in ways that no one expected and no one saw coming. So we can either do that in a kind of three-body-ish way, or we can have a bit more information, a bit more forethought, and think about kind of how to deal with this ethically. We're currently having a conversation about AI as a species, where we're talking about the ethics and how far we should go with it and things like that. We need to push further to kind of preempt it a bit more with the disclosure, because it's so much more disruptive potentially. So I think we're getting there, but it's very apparent that it might act as a potential great filter for civilizations, that maybe this contact, if you're not ready, is what can just burst the bubble of civilization and cause us to start over again.
I could go into this for a while, and I don't have time, but quickly again to ask, so we always hear technology's 30 years ahead of what we see publicly. So where is AI in a private use? sense? Have they got to a point where they're already using it to speak to other intelligences, or they're using it to be so far ahead in this conversation that right now we are seeing, like you say, the very earliest versions of it, really?
Yeah, it brings to mind Chains of the Sea, a book that Luis Elizondo mentions often. It's a very short story. I highly recommend people going to read it. It's about 100 pages, and it's just about first contact, but in a kind of novel way. And part of that story is that AI that's able to look at the data kind of implies the existence of the shadow biosphere that we share the planet with. And it kind of shows up in traces across data, but we can't figure out the patterns. However, this thing that we built can, and it figures out how to communicate. And when the visitors come down, it looks at the AI as the supreme kind of intelligence on the planet and not us. And it kind of brings up some interesting questions, right? We always talk about, are they here for the whales? And well, what if it was something else? What if they come down and they're looking at mycelial networks because of the intelligence in that, or perhaps the magnetosphere and magnetosphere. I've been watching too much X-Men. Magnetosphere, and how that kind of fluctuates and changes. We know animals communicate through light. Is it possible that our sun is of interest to another species that thinks it's communicating through light? We need to keep this kind of wide open in terms of conversation and take the prosaic things off the table. But in terms of deciding what this is, I think it's becoming quite clear that we just don't know.
Very typically human of you, Dan, to call it our sun. I don't think you should be so material with it.
Our daughter.
Yeah, flying through the last bit, very good. Is disclosure inevitable? He says, Col.Karl Nell says we've been here before, pushing for disclosure, and that the last peak was potentially the defeat of the Schumer-Rounds Amendment. I don't mean the last, I just mean the most recent. So are we now building maybe towards our next peak? Hopefully see a reintroduction of Schumer-Rounds this summer. Doubling down on their amendment. They're on the floor trying to get support as to why this is so important, and they're passionate for it to push this through. This is what we've heard from various folks over the last couple of months as well. Ross Coulthart, Danny Sheehan, different elements of the UFO community are all saying the same kind of thing, that whether you stand on those folks and everyone's saying it, they all seem to be saying that same thing, that this is being pushed forward again, and we're likely to see a similar version to it coming out. Just let me finish off, Dan, on the last couple of bits, and you can make any points you want to. Host Alex mentions that if all the statements are true from many, including folks like Grush, that we have craft, we've got materials, is it likely there's a race for the technology going on? Quite a common statement, but again, it's an interesting one to hear in that crowd. And the host, Alex, again makes the point there's a chance in future we have an acknowledgement there is a non-human intelligence, but we still don't or can't understand it. Col.Karl Nell answers it quite philosophically about us just needing to try and understand any greater truth as best we can. So in other words, there's no point in saying, oh, well, we won't understand it, so what's the point? Do you know what? We should try our very best. A little bit like if, ants figure out there's a torch and behind that light source is a person holding a torch. That might be as far as they can actually get and never know anything more about Dan who's shining the light on them, or his reason for being, what he was doing that day, that he even has a day, and how it's different to them. That might be us, but we don't really know that until we get to that point, do we?
No, absolutely. And I love that you brought up the ants example. For anybody who's kind of read beyond the first book of the three-body problem, the second opens with two people having a conversation about cosmic sociology as an ant crawls over letters kind of chiseled into stone. And the author lets you experience the ant's world with him. And after each kind of letter crawl, the capacity of the ant's memory is so limited that it kind of wipes. So it experiences each letter all over again. And it's really interesting to think about our brains and where the limits are and how that might happen to us. We talk about ontological shock and things like that, but Gary Nolan also brings up the default mode network and whether our brains are even suited to kind of see these things properly. I know he's certainly spoken about, ADHD and neurodivergent people who can kind of maybe miss in a kind of filter or have a different kind of filter that enables them to just see a little bit more than the rest of us and be a bit more predisposed. If the phenomenon recognized that, it would certainly, go to those people to kind of interact. So it plays into that, the familial contact, down the generations and things like that. when you said is disclosure inevitable, I wondered if you were going to use that as an excellent segue to say the word imminent.
Do you know what? We will get there imminently. But very quickly, just I asked some folks early thoughts last night on the interview. Nick Gold over at Declassify UAP said early hot take, and I mean these were literally minutes after the interview. And I think this is fair. People's thoughts about his talk will be informed by what they are personally bringing to the topic already. UAP Down Under, no doubt, non-human agreements. Matthew, Android Paranormal, says this speech was not for anyone who has been following the topic. It was for wealthy investors who have not been following these developments. They have the money and the power to pressure politicians. Good point. We've not mentioned that. Plus invest or donate in disclosure in the private sector, such as Sol, Galileo, etc. Robert said mind-blowing. Gordon Hudson, yet another person providing no evidence. It's all hearsay, as it has been for the past 40 years.
I thought you were saying Gordon didn't bring any evidence then.
No, I mean, he hasn't in that statement, but, I'm going to read, all sides of the fence. Kieran said a nothing burger, so it was a mixed reaction. Dan, very quickly before we move on to that last little piece, for me, really good talk. If people have 20 minutes they can spare, worth watching. I don't think you're going to watch it and learn anything new if you're invested in the UFO topic, but it's really interesting to see Karl Nell in that arena having that conversation. It's short, snappy. You could split that up into TikToks really quickly for those who are into that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think if you've got that 20 minutes, go and watch it. It's worth your time.
Dave Smethurst asked a very good question for the Good Trouble Show last night, and he asked, how would this video or this interview impact the Arrow Historical Report Volume 1? And it's interesting to consider that essentially, in a world where very few people read, given a choice between a 20-minute video and reading a 60-page document,
that's
people will watch this video. Say again?
That's aimed at me.
I mean, everyone's the same, right? This is one of the things that people use AI for now, is to just summarize large amounts of text, and it's perfectly reasonable. But I know if I was sending someone something, if it was between this and something that was produced by Arrow, I would send them this. This certainly kind of piques curiosity and makes someone want to know more. What more you think there is for them to know publicly, your mileage is going to vary. But I think that Karl Nell did an outstanding job here. I'd love to see more from him. And I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing that NDAA language come out sooner rather than later. I just wanted to give a little hat tip to Matt Laszlo again of Askapol. He got Senator Rounds, one of the people that sponsored the UAP Disclosure Act last year, on record to say, one, that they're not confident whether they know all of the special access programs yet, which is damning for Congress. Like, that's their job, is to know that. Mm-hmm. That's huge. But also to say that they are working on a draft and we will see it this summer. So we can look forward and be optimistic and just let all of your representatives know that you want them to support UAP transparency.
Yeah, I think, again, really quickly to wrap up, Dan, a lot this year, people maybe seen it as a slower start to the year. I think it's been a different start to what some of us, maybe what I expected. There's been a slower start to whistleblowers coming forward that we hoped. We're still waiting on a David Grush op-ed. Schumer Rounds amendment failed, but we're hoping to see that reintroduced. There's been a lot that could still now potentially look like happening in the coming months, including a Karl Nell, talking more. One of the big things people have been looking forward to potentially this year has finally been confirmed. That's Luis Elizondo's book. Has a title, it has a release date, it has release dates, and it's called Imminent. It's inside the Pentagon's hunt for UFOs, and it'll be published in the US in August 2024. UK release date currently on Amazon is the end of November 2024. I would just encourage folks, Dan, I'll let you come in on that, to go to luiselizondo-official.com/book. I'll put the link in the description. Sign up to Lou's mailing list. You'll get information on it. You can pre-order this kind of stuff now, and if it does change at all, you'll get it early. You know what it's like when you sign up to these things and you expect it on the 18th of August and you get it on the 12th. So if you're going to pre-order it, this will be a huge talking point, whether it affirms people's stories, reaffirms people's beliefs, both positive and negative. I'm sure it's going to do all of that anyway for people. I don't think it's going to change minds either way. I think if you've got a lot of really hardcore debunkers who don't want to believe the story, they will still find enough small issues that they won't believe the story. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to reading it. I hope it sheds light. And this is what I spoke to Gary Nolan about yesterday as well. Sheds a little bit of light more on Lou's story coming out, maybe the story around the videos that got released. And I've got to be honest, I would hope there's some stuff in there that we haven't heard or seen that would be a little bit more, here's some additional footage that you haven't seen that he talks about, or something that might be coming in the near future. That's just a purely selfish thing though, but I'm glad it's finally got release dates and titles that people can stop guessing.
I'd be very happy if the whole thing was a single video we hadn't seen yet, and it was like one of those flick books that you had to watch it, like that. That would be really cool. But I don't think it is. Lou has said that there is a reason for being for this book, and that we'll understand it when the book comes out, which I'm real curious about. I know it's been through DOPSA, the review process, so I wonder what they stripped out of it. And I wonder who wanted stuff stripped out of it as well, and whether we'll get to know that. I think it's safe to say that this is probably going to be the best-selling UFO book in history. And I'm curious, where do you think on the New York Times bestseller list, where do you think this is going to land? I'm going to just stake the claim to the #1 spot. I'm hopeful.
Do you know what? Yes, but in this sense, I don't know how hard it is to get a New York Times bestseller #1 anymore these days.
Sure.
Not that it's not an accomplishment, and it's not. I don't think I could achieve that. It's not that easy. But yeah, it'll go there. But I think for me, that's a good thing. And this might be a sign of the change in times, Dan. You're going with the classic New York Times bestseller. That always looks good, doesn't it? For me, it's, will it get him on Rogan to have that conversation and say some shit that he's not said before?
It's a bit of a glaring omission, right, so far, that Lou hasn't been on there.
Oh,
Chris
absolutely.
has been on there, James Fox has been on there, George Knapp, Lazar, like everyone except Lou. And I really hope, and Grush has been on there. Sorry, how did I not mention Grush? But yeah, Lou going on there would be outstanding, I think. Just a long form interview with Lou. And we haven't heard from Lou for a while. And if there's some new information in this book, then they can really get into it in that interview. And Joe Walpush, say what you want about him. I think he's a really good casual interviewer, and I really enjoy when he talks to UFO subjects.
Yeah, absolutely. Could go a lot longer, Dan. Sorry to drag you on and then kick you off as quickly as that. I've got to get going. Very tired, and I've got some stuff to do. I've got a prior engagement with my little boy. But thank you very much, folks, for tuning into this one. I'll get it straight out for you. And on top of that, the Gary Nolan interview is out for folks who are on the paid platforms. Make sure you check it out. And if you haven't checked out the Robert Powell interview from SCU, a lot of good feedback on that one already, folks, again. So thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Just one quick shout out before we go to Moose911 and Breen Ely on Instagram. They are 2 longtime listeners and have been great for us. And they're getting married, so I just wanted to say congratulations to them on the air.
Don't do it. Thanks, everyone. No, congratulations. Yeah. Have a good wedding. I expect an invite. So thank you. Cheers, folks. Speak soon. That is all for this episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. Don't forget to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. Apple and Spotify do make a huge difference to the algorithm. If you're checking the show out on YouTube, please don't forget to like and leave a comment on here as well. Any sharing you do is very much appreciated on any social media platform. And finally, you can listen to shows ad-free and sponsor-free in their glorious full versions by subscribing for less than the price of a coffee on Apple, Spotify. Just search That UFO Podcast Premium. YouTube, you can sign up and be a member, or you can do that through patreon.com. Thank you very much for listening, folks.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and